The Lord be with you. Welcome back to this series on all things working together for good. Just trying to look at practical ways that this works itself out in characters' lives, maybe even in our own life. So we have been following a biblical character. That is the character of Jonah and his story from the so-called minor prophets, the 12, as they are grouped together in the Hebrew Bible. And another reason Jonah is of some significance is because even the Lord Jesus himself said to the people in his day, no sign is going to be given to you except for the sign of Jonah. The Lord seemed to think that there was something worthwhile in the life of Jonah that was reflective of the day and age in which he was living and operating in. And it makes me wonder if there's something about Jonah that we can read in our own day that will help us to better understand what the Lord is doing, what the Lord has done, how the Lord works through certain given situations. In our first video, we talked about what it looks like when the word of the Lord comes, what it does in this world, what it does in our lives. There's a very dynamic effect that it seems to have, and we can choose how we're going to respond to the Lord's word. What is fascinating about Jonah's narrative is being an actual prophet who is, by biblical definition, someone who has the Lord's word put into their own mouths. Jonah refuses God's invitation and actually runs in the opposite direction. And we said this is very curious. This is a very curious way to begin the story. So we're waiting to see what happens. What happens when even God's own chosen prophet refuses to listen to him. And that's where we pick up the story today. So again, I'm reading from the Complete Jewish Study Bible. And we pick up Jonah chapter 1, beginning in verse 4. However, Yahweh let loose over the sea a violent wind, which created such stormy conditions that the ship threatened to break to pieces. The sailors were frightened, and each cried out to his God. They threw the cargo overboard to make the ship easier for them to control. Meanwhile, Jonah had gone down below into the hold, where he lay fast asleep. The ship's captain found him and said to him, "What do you mean by sleeping? Get up, call on your God. Maybe the God will remember us and we won't die." Then they said to each other, "Come, let us draw lots to find out who is to blame for this calamity." They drew lots, and Jonah was singled out. They said to him, "Tell us now, why has this calamity come upon us? What work do you do? Where are you from? What is your country? Which is your people?" He answered them, "I am a Hebrew, and I fear Yahweh, the God of heaven, who made both the sea and the dry land." At this, the men grew very afraid and said to him, "What is this you have done?" For the men knew he was trying to get away from Yahweh, since he had told them. These are the true words of our eternal God. So the first thing that we see, the first response that we get from Jonah ignoring and running away from the word of the Lord as it comes to him, is even though he's trying to go in a particular direction towards Tarshish aboard this cargo ship, Yahweh God throws a storm onto the sea to prevent the ship from getting to its destination. As a matter of fact, we're told that it was such a violent storm that the ship threatened to break to pieces. Now, the way that the sailors respond to this, these are all of the people who are above deck, is that they cry out to their gods. So this is a polytheistic world at this time. Lots of different people from lots of different regions had their own god and maybe even multiple gods. So there was a belief in very specified gods, gods of specific domains. So there might be a god for the wind, there might be a god of the heavens, there might be a god of the sea, there might be a god of the storm, so on and so forth. Whatever you can think of, there's probably some kind of localized deity associated with it. So it is not uncommon to have these sailors each crying out to different gods. What's interesting is the one person who's missing from this mix is Jonah, who has gone down into the innards of the ship. Now remember that motion and remember that specification. That will come in to be an important detail later. The captain finds him dead asleep, completely undisturbed by all of the events that are going on in the outside world. So it's interesting where the divine crosses over into the human realm, where God's anger and God's fury and the preventative nature of this storm is spilling over in the earthly realm and everybody's suffering from it. Jonah's the one person who's completely oblivious to the divine. He is just in the earthly realm in a deep sleep. The captain almost shamefully has to forcefully wake him and to demand of him, what do you mean by sleeping? Get up. Call on your God. We need all hands on deck. We need people calling out to every deity that we can think of, because who knows, maybe the God, whichever one is responsible for this, will remember us and we won't die. Now, the philosophy in the widespread world, which isn't that different than today, is that God or the gods might be very aloof from us. And we might need to get their attention. We might need to be waving our flags in our hands and crying and screaming and doing whatever we can so that they'll notice us and remember, oh yes, there are some people in distress. Maybe I should do something about that since I'm the only one who can. So the captain asks Jonah to join in sort of the flag waving to try and get the attention of the gods. Maybe Jonah has a god that's different than the other ones that are being prayed to. We're never actually told if Jonah prays or not, which is interesting. The text is silent, which almost makes it sound like everybody else is praying, but Jonah, even after he's woken up, refuses to do it. Because the last time he spoke to God, or God spoke to him, he didn't like what God had to say. Therefore, he seems to be completely ghosting God, completely ignoring him altogether. So meantime, there's this little scene going on the deck where the crew say, come, let's draw lots or cast lots to find out who is to blame for this calamity. To the best of my knowledge, we aren't really sure what it meant to cast or to draw lots. You read something very similar in Jesus' day as the soldiers cast lots to see who would get Jesus' robe, which was all sewn from one piece of garment. Therefore, it was of some significance, some value. As best as I understand it, this is almost like casting dice and seeing who gets the highest or the lowest number. We might also think of it like drawing straws, who gets the shortest straw. So it's some kind of narrowing the field to single somebody out, and it singles out, through whatever method they used, Jonah, which is interesting. Sometimes we think of non-biblical ways of doing things as suspicious, right? That God surely won't use those things because it's not a prescribed way that God has given to us. But don't think that God can't control the lot. Don't think that God can't use the information available to the people based upon their beliefs and point them to the right answers. So as soon as they superstitiously think it's Jonah, they start asking a litany of questions. Tell us where you're from, what kind of work that you do, why this thing is happening to us, what's your country, what's your people? And Jonah says the absolute worst thing that he could say, I am a Hebrew, and I fear Yahweh, the God of heaven, who made both the sea and the dry land. Now we're told at the end of this that apparently somewhere in there, he also told them that he was trying to run away from his God. And that's bad news. They recognize immediately, well, clearly your God doesn't want us to get to our destination, so this really is your fault. But maybe what's even more frightening in the details that Jonah gives them is my God, Yahweh, is the God of the heavens, the sea, and the dry land. We have all three spheres of existence represented by this one God. Now, again, that's very unusual in the ancient world. Normally, your God has domain over one thing. And this God, the Hebrew God, is the all-powerful, all-encompassing creator God who is over everything. Heaven is a synonym for sky, that which you see above you. The sea, which they are currently on, as well as the dry land. In other words, there's nowhere you can go to get away from this God. And if you are in the middle of trying to fight a storm, this is very bad news. Again, Jonah gets chastised by the very people who don't even know his God. It's almost as if God is using people who are on the complete fringes and maybe even the other side of relationship with him to chastise the one who should know better because he has been in direct relationship with him. There is also sort of the inverse of this story told later in the Gospels. We find a story of Jesus sleeping in a boat when a great storm happens. And there's a very similar response from his disciples, just like the crew. They're doing everything they can to fight this storm, and it's just not working. So finally, they wake Jesus up, just like Jonah got woken up, and they say to Jesus, do something or we're going to die. Don't you care that we're perishing? Only in this case, Jesus rebukes the storm, and then he turns to them and says, why do you have such little faith? Which begs the question, when you go through a storm in life, whether that is a real literal storm, something that occurs in nature, or whether it's figurative for any kind of distress coming into your life, where do you suppose the storm comes from? And where do you think God is in the midst of the storm? Sometimes we can get the impression that God has absolutely nothing to do with the storm. It's just kind of some random calamity that unfortunately falls upon us, and we're sort of bitter and angry about it. Sometimes we think the storm comes from the enemy, that we're under attack, and God isn't defending us, or we need to convince God to defend us. Sometimes we can believe that God sent the storm, sort of like he did in Jonah's day, where the storm is sent there to discipline us or to correct us, to judge us. And sometimes we think that that means that God has no love for us, or that we can't be redeemed through this. But it's interesting, God doesn't allow the storm to drown Jonah, to kill Jonah. God is getting Jonah's attention. And I wonder sometimes, just like that story of Jesus, if instead of looking at the storm and fearing for the factors that are out of our control, if instead we should be drawing our attention to the one who controls the wind and the waves, and recognize that God is sometimes in the boat with us, going through the very same storm. We just need to put our faith in the right place. This is a very interesting place to end the narrative. So the question is, now that they know it's Jonah's fault, what's going to happen through the storm? And to find out the answer to that, we're just going to have to wait till the next video. So until the next time, in these days of ongoing storms, may the peace of God and the God of peace be with you. Amen.